Have you ever gazed at a beautiful sunset or a starry sky and been filled with awe and wonder? Perhaps, like me, you've even found yourself thinking at that moment, there must be a God. Are experiences like these really evidence for God, though? Yes, they are, and my guest, Noah McKay, is about to explain why. Noah is a graduate student in philosophy at Purdue University. This argument from beauty is unlike the others you might have heard before. In many ways, this one is more modest, and because of that, it's actually stronger. Let's get started.
Noah, can you define some of the key terms in your argument first? Things like aesthetic experience and theism and naturalism.
Yeah. So by theism, I mean the view that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect and incorporeal creator of the universe who desires for humans to know him and to love what's good. And by naturalism, I mean the view that there's no such being and that only the physical world exists. So you'll notice that theism and naturalism don't exhaust the theoretical territory. There are some views I don't consider in the paper, like deism or pantheism or idealism. I'm just comparing these two sort of reigning paradigms in metaphysics. By aesthetic experience, I mean something very particular. I mean an experience of awe, reverence, and delight that typically accompanies the perception or the contemplation of something beautiful. So an aesthetic experience is different from an aesthetic apprehension or an aesthetic judgment. Suppose you think that there are no aesthetic properties out there in the world. Beauty and ugliness are just things we project onto objects. Well, it doesn't follow from that you can't have aesthetic experiences, right? You can still react with awe, reverence, and delight, even if there are no mind-independent properties that you're apprehending. And similarly, aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment come apart. So if you're an error theorist about aesthetic judgments, for example, if you think all aesthetic judgments are false, well, you can still experience awe, reverence, and delight in response to something that other people would call beautiful. And similarly, you might judge something to be beautiful despite not having an aesthetic experience in response to it. Like there are lots of kinds of art, genres of visual art, for example, that I don't experience as beautiful, but I believe based on the testimony of experts that there is something beautiful about those artworks, even though I don't experience it. So when I say aesthetic experience, I'm just talking about this sort of subjective response.
Very good. Okay, that was clear. So now let's just look at your argument. If you don't mind, will you read through the argument first, and then after that, we're just going to look at how you would defend each premise in the argument.
Yeah, okay. So premise 1 says that human beings are capable of having and do have profound aesthetic experiences in abundance. Premise 2 is that naturalism does not adequately explain premise 1. Premise 3 says that theism does adequately explain premise 1. And the conclusion is that all else being equal, theism is more probable than naturalism. Now, I'd like to make a brief comment about the scope of the argument. I don't think this is a knockdown argument for theism or that it's rationally compelling. All I'm trying to show is that aesthetic experience is evidence for theism, in the sense that in light of these facts about aesthetic experience, we should be more confident that theism is true than otherwise.
Very good. Yeah, and that's a very modest scope for the argument. Like you said, it doesn't have to make it more probable than naturalism overall. It's just, hey, with respect to this particular piece of evidence favors theism over naturalism. But there can be lots of other evidence, and maybe when you tally it all up, naturalism comes out on top.
Yeah, that's right. So even if you're an atheist or an agnostic, you can still be a fan of this argument.
On average, we spend about 1/3 of our lives at work. That's a huge chunk of your life. So you should choose a career that is meaningful and impactful, especially if you're a Christian. We're called to be good stewards of the talents and time that God has given us. So which careers should you consider? How about the ones that are aimed at solving some of the world's most pressing problems? And if you make one of those careers your goal, what specific steps do you need to take to get there? These questions can feel overwhelming, even paralyzing if you're trying to figure all of this out alone. But you don't have to. There's a program that can help. Christians for Impact is a charity designed to help Christians with career discernment. They have over 50 experienced mentors who will pray with you one-on-one, help you map out a career plan, and connect you with hundreds of Christian professionals. You might be thinking, this sounds awesome, but how much does it cost? Well, this is the most amazing part. This mentorship program is completely free. How does it work? Just spend 10 minutes reading the career guide linked in the description below. At the end of that career guide, you'll see a link to apply for a free one-on-one mentorship. After submitting your application, you'll hear a response within 1 to 2 weeks, connecting you with a career mentor. If you're a committed Christian based in the US or the UK, especially if you're between the ages of 18 and 25, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss. So check out the career guide linked in the description below and apply today. While you're there, check out the Christians for Impact newsletter and podcast. Both will provide you with even more resources to help you start navigating your career journey today.
Yeah. Okay, so let's walk through your defense of each premise. I don't know if you want to say a whole lot in defense of premise one, maybe just give examples. You can tell us how you would defend that we have aesthetic experiences. I can report I have aesthetic experiences. So this premise doesn't require a whole lot of defense for me, but maybe somebody else needs some defense.
Yeah. I think there are two ways to know that premise one is true. The first is on the basis of personal experience. So most of us have had the kinds of experiences I'm talking about. I'll just give you one example in my own case. In 2019, I believe it was, the fall or winter of 2019, I was in Switzerland and I caught a glimpse of the starry sky above the Swiss Alps at night. And I was just, like I said, those three components, awe, reverence, and delight, were just overwhelming. And I have similar experiences when I see sunsets or when I listen to classical music. And obviously, it's going to vary depending on the individual, what sorts of perceptions give rise to these experiences. But I expect that most people have had them. So that's the first way I think you can know that premise one is true. The second way is just on the basis of testimony. So even if you don't have a lot of aesthetic experiences, you can go ask other people, and they're almost certain to tell you, yes, I've had experiences like that.
Okay, now how about premise two, that naturalism doesn't adequately account for these sorts of aesthetic experiences?
Yeah. Now, premise two, I think, is the key premise, and the bulk of the paper is dedicated to defending this one. So what I tried to show is that there's no plausible Darwinian explanation for premise one. And I assume in the paper that if there's going to be a naturalistic explanation of our capacity for profound aesthetic experiences, that it's going to have to be a Darwinian one, although there is an alternative that I think we'll talk about later. I start by pointing out, look, it's really difficult to see how aesthetic experience provides us with an adaptive advantage, right? Because if you're trying to give a Darwinian explanation of aesthetic experience, you've got to explain how aesthetic experiences could have helped our ancestors better survive and reproduce. And as many have pointed out, like in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, Plantinga points this out. He says it's really difficult to think of what sort of adaptive advantage would accrue to an organism who's stunned by the beauty of the Grand Tetons, for example. That just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that's going to help you survive and reproduce. Now, evolutionary psychologists and biologists have, in some cases, tried to tackle this problem, although it's underexplored. I'll talk about just two of these Darwinian accounts and explain why I don't think they work. The first sort of account, and this has been defended by John Barrow, for example, says that the reason aesthetic experience is adaptive is because it makes us more sensitive to certain environmental cues. So the fact that we have an aesthetic preference for lush landscapes and for landscapes with lots of water in them. I mean, Barrow makes that claim. I'm not sure how much empirical support there is for the idea that we're more attracted to places with lots of water, but let's suppose that's true. The idea is, well, these aesthetic preferences are going to incline us to inhabit these fruitful habitats, these habitats that are hospitable to human life. And it'll keep us away from those habitats that are potentially dangerous or harmful to human life. And we like colors, and lots of fruits are brightly colored. So maybe our aesthetic experience for colorful things is going to help us find food. And maybe our fascination with sunrises and sunsets is going to help us keep better track of time. That's another example that's sometimes given. So the broad idea is having aesthetic experiences makes you more aware of things about your environment that are relevant to your survival. And what I say in the paper is it's really plausible that awareness of those features of your environment is really important. But it's not clear why you would need to have aesthetic experiences in response to those features of your environment in order to be aware of them in the relevant fitness-enhancing way, right? It seems like we're capable of noticing lots of things that don't strike us as beautiful. And in fact, there's this sort of paradox because it seems that in order for me to be struck by the beauty of a sunset, I'd have to already notice that the sun is setting. And same thing with sunrises. And so it's a sort of puzzling how aesthetic experience would explain why we're sensitive to those features of our environments. It seems like we've got to be sensitive to them already. Then there's another issue, which I actually don't mention in the paper, but I've since decided is important, and that's that lots of non-human species are sensitive to these environmental features. They don't have any problem teasing out the distinctions between harmful and hospitable habitats, and yet presumably they're not having profound aesthetic experiences all the time. So I don't think this sort of account is plausible. Here's another one, and this one comes from David Rothenberg. He's a philosopher of music. He's got a book called The Survival of the Beautiful. And what Rothenberg says is that aesthetic experience is the product of sexual selection. Sexual selection was proposed as a mechanism of evolution by Darwin himself, and it's been utilized by lots of other evolutionary biologists since then. Here's roughly the idea behind sexual selection. There are some traits that get selected not because they help an organism adapt to its environment per se, but because females prefer to mate with males who have that trait. So the favorite example is the peacock's plumage. It's really clumsy. It makes it harder to hide from predators. Having lots of plumage doesn't help peacocks navigate their environments, find food, and so on and so forth. But peafowls will only mate with peacocks who have really colorful plumage. And so there's still selection pressure towards the relevant trait. And the idea is that you get this feedback loop going in the peacock population. So the peafowls will only mate with the males who have colorful plumage. And so their little baby peacocks and peafowls end up with the genes both for the preference for the plumage and the genes for the plumage. And so eventually the aesthetic preferences of the peacock population get narrower and narrower, and the males become more and more extravagantly colorful.
Plumed. Yeah.
Yes, plumed, thank you. And then eventually you end up with these spectacularly beautiful birds. So that's the idea. And Rothenberg and others have extended this sort of account to human beings too. So there's a paper I cite by, their last name is Zeidel. Their first name eludes me at the moment. But Zeidel extends this account to our aesthetic preference for different kinds of artwork. And so what Zeidel says is, look, if you are a young female and you're trying to judge the competence of a potential mate, well, if he's really good at producing artworks, well, that signals all sorts of traits of his that are relevant to reproductive fitness. Like he's probably pretty smart, he's probably pretty coordinated. And so it makes sense for you, if you're a young female, to go after a guy who's good at making art. And the idea is you get the same sort of genetic feedback loop you have in the case of the peacocks and peafowls. And eventually, the human population ends up dominated by people who have artistic abilities and aesthetic preferences for great artworks. So that's the account. I think there are several problems with it, like a lot of problems. Let me mention the biggest ones. First of all, at best, this gives us an explanation for some of our sexual preferences. Because according to the account, right, the plumage makes the peacock sexually attractive to the peafowls, and artistic ability makes human males sexually attractive to human females. But sexual attraction and aesthetic appreciation are distinct phenomena, right? They come apart in lots of cases. So I think the Garden of the Gods is beautiful, but I'm not sexually attracted to the Garden of the Gods, right? So even if you can explain why human beings have sexual preferences for artistic people, that's not going to explain why we're actually aesthetically attuned to the artwork that they produce. That's the biggest problem, in my view. A second problem is that at best, this sort of account is only going to explain our aesthetic preferences for certain features of members of our own species, right? So I think orchids are beautiful, but there's no sexual selective pressure for an orchid to like conform to my aesthetic sensibilities. The orchid doesn't have to worry about whether I'm interested in mating with it. So Yeah, I think most of the profoundly beautiful phenomena we encounter in nature are non-human phenomena, and this account isn't going to explain our aesthetic preferences for any of that. So that's roughly the argument behind premise 2. You might worry, well, Noah, just because you can't think of a plausible Darwinian explanation for aesthetic experience doesn't mean that there is no such explanation. And that's true to some extent. But I think if it's the case that aesthetic experiences don't confer adaptive advantages on individuals, if we can't think of any adaptive advantages conferred by aesthetic experiences, that's pretty good evidence that there are none, because we're reasonably good judges of what would or wouldn't help us survive and reproduce, right? We have to make judgments like that all the time. And it makes sense that we'd be reliable judges of what will or won't redound to our reproductive fitness, given that we're in the business of surviving and reproducing. So I'd say the fact that we can't think of adaptive advantages that accrue to organisms who have aesthetic experiences is pretty good evidence that there are none. And so the argument would be these sorts of considerations suggest that there is no good Darwinian explanation forthcoming. Naturalism just doesn't have the resources available to explain the data captured by premise 1. That was a very long-winded answer, but like I said,
No, that was good. That was good. We'll come back to a particular Darwinian explanation in a bit, but for now, let's leave it there. So premise 3 says, well, theism can account for this abundance of aesthetic experiences that humans have. How do you defend that premise?
Good question. In general, I think what's necessary to have a good personal explanation of some phenomenon is 2 criteria. First, you have to show that some agent has reason to bring the phenomenon about. And then second, you've got to show that agent has the power or the ability to bring that phenomenon about. And I think we meet both of those criteria in God's case. First, God has good reasons to populate the mental landscape with aesthetic experiences. First of all, aesthetic experience is just intrinsically valuable. And I think we can agree that's true even if we deny that aesthetic properties are mind independent. Like, you don't have to be an objectivist about beauty in order to think that the aesthetic experiences themselves are intrinsically valuable. So that's the first point. But the second point is that aesthetic experiences, at least according to some theists, give you a kind of cognitive and affective access to God. So there are some biblical authors who seem to suggest that the beauty in nature speaks to God's existence and his power and his divinity. And I'll just say, in my own case, I think that's true. When I have profound aesthetic experiences, I just have the sense of God's might and God's presence. And so if aesthetic experiences provide this kind of access to God, then, well, that's a good reason, it seems like, to give people lots of experiences of that kind. So I think there are more reasons we could give, but those are at least 2. And now, so that's our first criteria. The second criterion is easy to satisfy in God's case because God's omnipotent and so can do anything that's metaphysically possible. And clearly it is metaphysically possible for us to have these experiences because we do have them. So,
yeah. Okay, very good. So you've given us the argument and briefly defended each of the premises. Now, I think it can be helpful to the viewer to hear you explain the differences between your argument and the arguments of others who have. It's an argument. They're related to beauty. Your argument and like Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga, they're all related to beauty, but yours does something different than Swinburne's and Plantinga's. Can you lay that out, what that difference or those differences are?
That's right. I think these differences are important. So the first thing to note about the argument I've made is that it doesn't depend on aesthetic objectivism. So many versions of the argument from beauty start by arguing there are objective aesthetic properties out there in the world. Some things are objectively beautiful. And then they go on to argue that theism is the best explanation for why objective beauty exists, or for why there's so much objective beauty in the world. And that's not what I'm doing in this paper. I'm leaving it as an open question whether beauty is something objective. But I'm saying, well, even if it's not, even if beauty is just a product of us, right? It's a product of our attitudes. You're still going to have to explain why those attitudes arise in the first place. You got to be careful, because I just talked as if what I'm trying to explain are attitudes about whether things are beautiful, but I'm not really doing that, because those would be aesthetic judgments. What you have to explain still is why it is that we have these experiences, these subjective experiences of awe, reverence, and delight. So that's one difference between my argument and Swinburne's and Plantinga's, is that they're both moral objectivists. But there's some more specific differences too. So let's start with Swinburne. Swinburne has this Bayesian aesthetic argument for theism. And for the folks at home, a Bayesian argument is basically just an argument that uses probability theory to try to show that some phenomenon is evidence for a hypothesis. And so Swinburne tries to show that the existence and prevalence of beauty in the world is evidence for theism by showing that the probability that there would be such beauty in the world is greater given theism than given atheism. So theism, in a sense, predicts that there'd be a lot of beauty in the world, and atheism doesn't similarly predict that. And then the idea is, well, that shows that aesthetic experience is evidence for theism. My argument doesn't involve making any explicit probability judgments. My argument's an abductive argument rather than a Bayesian argument. So instead of asking, do theism or naturalism predict the phenomenon captured by premise one, I'm asking, what resources can they bring to bear to explain the data captured by premise one? And this is maybe an important difference. I'm actually less confident now than I used to be that this is an important difference. But there's a contingent among Christian philosophers who adopt a view called skeptical theism. This is a popular response to the problem of evil. And skeptical theism basically says, well, we're not in a position to know what God would or wouldn't do if he existed, because the reasons God has for doing things are just beyond our ken, right? Us trying to predict what God would do is like a 6-month-old infant trying to predict what a football player is going to do in the middle of a game, right? The infant doesn't understand the rules. There are considerations that just aren't accessible for the infant because they're cognitively underdeveloped and they don't understand the rules of football. And the argument is we're in a similar epistemic position vis-a-vis God's decisions. But if that's right, it doesn't seem like we should be making these explicit probability judgments about what God would likely do if he existed. And so you might think that poses a problem for Swinburne's argument. And it's at least not immediately obvious that it poses a problem for my argument. Although, like I said, I'm less confident of that now than I used to be. But then let's go to Plantinga's argument. So Plantinga's argument is different from Swinburne's. What Plantinga says is, well, there's no reason to think, given naturalism, that we would be able to reliably detect these aesthetic properties. Because remember, as Plantinga argues, there doesn't seem to be any evolutionary advantage to being able to detect those properties. But it seems like we can. Like, it seems like we are reliable judges of whether things are beautiful, at least some of the time. And that's puzzling if naturalism is true. Now, again, I think this isn't so much a problem with Plantinga's argument, because again, I think there are some strong considerations in favor of aesthetic objectivism. I'm not sure I'm an aesthetic objectivist. This is a really interesting question, and I don't have a settled position on it. But one advantage of my argument over Plantinga's, let's say, is that even if you're not an aesthetic objectivist, you can still buy my argument.
Yeah, that was clear. Okay, so you laid out, I think it's a really crucial difference that your argument doesn't depend on aesthetic objective. I think, in my experience, people that other forms of the argument, Swinburne's, Plantinga's, in the past I've interviewed, I think his name's Philip Talon. He wrote the chapter in the 24 or so book on an argument for beauty, but his depends on aesthetic objectivism. So it's an easy kind of out for somebody to just say, oh, but I don't believe in aesthetic objectivism. Yours, since it leaves that open, I think is a stronger argument.
Yeah. And I mean, another thing to note is if you aren't persuaded by my argument, it's good to know that arguments like Talon's are independent of the argument I'm making here. So one important implication of these differences is that beauty might constitute evidence for theism in more than one way. So there might be evidence for theism from the prevalence of profound aesthetic experiences, and then there might also be evidence for theism from the existence and prevalence of objective aesthetic properties. So I think that's good news. For people who would like to have a theistic argument from beauty, it's good news that there's more than one way to make it.
Now, in the paper, you address several objections to your argument. We're not going to have time to look at all the different objections. There was one in particular that I thought, and in fact, I think you say in the paper, this is the most serious objection, or it has the best shot. I get it. It seems like you're like, of the objections available, this seems like it's got a really good shot, at least. And that's this evolutionary spandrel objection. So can you explain what that is?
So first, let's talk about what a spandrel is. A spandrel is a trait that's a byproduct of other traits for which evolution selected directly. But spandrels aren't themselves selected by evolutionary pressures. So let me give you an example. Top-heavy is a trait human beings have because we've got very large heads, because we've got big brains. That's an evolutionary spandrel because evolution didn't select for top-heaviness. In fact, being top-heavy is inconvenient. But evolution did select for large brain size. There are lots of adaptive advantages that come along with having a large brain. Being top-heavy isn't itself adaptive, but it's a byproduct of other traits that are adaptive. And the suggestion that some evolutionary biologists have made is that aesthetic cognition is a spandrel. There's some other cluster of cognitive traits we have that it's adaptive to have, and that produces aesthetic experiences as a byproduct. Now, the literature on that is complicated, and there's a lot of neuroscience involved, not all of which I understand, to be clear. But I do cite some relevant papers folks can go check out if they're more interested in learning about the spandrel hypothesis in more detail. I think that the spandrel hypothesis itself is actually quite plausible. And I think it's the option naturalists should go for. I think a naturalist should say that aesthetic experience is a spandrel, given that there's no plausible story to be told about how aesthetic experiences are adaptive. But the problem is, I don't think while the spandrel account might be able to explain why we have some aesthetic experiences, it's not going to explain why there's such a close fit between our aesthetic preferences and natural phenomena. So here's something interesting that's in tension with the whole naturalist picture, but I think it makes special trouble for the spandrel hypothesis. Human beings don't just have aesthetic preferences for a few things in nature, nor do we only have aesthetic preferences for things that are hospitable to us or that are useful for us. We have aesthetic preferences for all sorts of different natural phenomena, some of which are hostile or dangerous to human life. We have aesthetic preferences for mountains and nebulae and deep sea creatures and poisonous animals and dangerous predators like tigers, right? Why do human beings find tigers beautiful? It's just really puzzling. And so I think this fact that nature is pervasively beautiful, well, actually, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I think this is actually one of the biggest problems with some of the Darwinian explanations we talked about earlier, right? They say aesthetic experience is adaptive, but it's hard to see why being attracted to things that are dangerous, like predators or inhospitable environments, would be adaptive. But then the fact that nature is...
I'll say briefly, the tiger is a great example of a predator that we might have this aesthetic experience of.
Well, let me tell you my favorite.
Yeah, go. I liked your favorite example in the paper. What is that?
Oh yeah, my favorite example is the sea swallow. It's also known as the blue angel. It's a kind of sea slug, but when you think the word slug, you think like this slimy. It's not anything like that. Some sea slugs are just spectacularly beautiful, and I think especially the blue angel. But the blue angel is really dangerous because it eats Portuguese man-o'-wars, and it studs the extremities of its body with their stinging cells. And so touching a blue angel is like touching a Portuguese man-o'-war. Namely, it's not fun and it'll really hurt you. And so it's just so strange that we would find creatures like this to be so spectacularly gorgeous, given that they're really dangerous for us. And again, it's not just predators or dangerous non-human species. It's also things like the ocean or distant galaxies photographed by the Hubble telescope. I mean, it's just things that
I
to which
often,
we were.
I-
Yeah.
I'll say this, I often, if I see like a vast desert, I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Like, even though
Yeah.
it's horribly it's
Yeah,
completely inhospitable, I wouldn't.
one of the worst places on Earth to be, right?
Yeah,
If you're a
but
human being, is in the desert.
just those rolling kind of mounds and to watch it shift, I'm like, wow, that's so beautiful.
Right, good. Okay, now, I actually should have brought this point up earlier when we were discussing the justification for premise 2. So, I did things a little bit out of order. But now that we got that out of the way, let's return to the spandrel objection, right? So we were talking
Yeah.
about a problem for the spandrel objection, and that is that there's this close fit between our aesthetic preferences and natural phenomena. Why do I say this close fit is difficult for the spandrel hypothesis to explain? Well, if you offer a Darwinian explanation for aesthetic experience, it's easy to see why we would have an aesthetic preference for a wide range of natural phenomena, because having aesthetic experiences is adaptive, and so the more of them you have, the better in general, right? The proponent of the spandrel hypothesis can't say that, because according to them, aesthetic experiences aren't adaptive. They're just a byproduct. Like, you might think, well, maybe we just got lucky. Maybe it's just a coincidence that the world is so spectacularly beautiful from our perspective. And that's possible. Like, it's possible that it's a coincidence, but I argue in the paper it's a highly improbable coincidence. And here's why. And I'm borrowing this argument, the broad contours of this argument, from natural theologian F.R. Tennant from the early 20th century. Tennant points out, well, look, human artifacts that are made without any aesthetic intent don't tend to be beautiful, because making beautiful things is hard, right? So when we human beings create human artifacts, unless we try to make them beautiful, they tend not to be. Human artifacts that are made without any aesthetic intent are examples of what I call aesthetically indifferent objects. An aesthetically indifferent object is an object that meets two conditions. First, it wasn't designed with our aesthetic preferences in mind. And second, it didn't play a role in shaping our aesthetic preferences. So, not designed to fit our aesthetic preferences and didn't play a role in shaping our aesthetic preferences. Now, what proportion of aesthetically indifferent objects are beautiful? Well, it seems like the case of human artifacts, of aesthetically indifferent human artifacts, shows us that the proportion is very small. But what's the proportion of natural phenomena that we find beautiful? Well, I'd say the proportion is very great. The proportion is much greater than the proportion is in the case of aesthetically indifferent human artifacts. And that's good evidence that natural phenomena aren't aesthetically indifferent. That's good evidence that either those natural phenomena were designed with our aesthetic preferences in mind, or those natural phenomena played a role in shaping our aesthetic preferences. Well, the proponent of the spandrel hypothesis shouldn't say that those phenomena shaped our aesthetic preferences, because remember, according to the spandrel hypothesis, our aesthetic experience is a recent offshoot of unrelated adaptations. So it's arbitrary which things we have aesthetic preferences for. And so then it seems like there's pressure for someone who adopts the spandrel hypothesis to think that natural phenomena were designed with our aesthetic preferences in mind. So I think, ironically, if you accept the spandrel hypothesis, there's actually a lot of pressure to adopt the theistic explanation alongside it.
Okay, we're nearing the end here. A moment ago, you mentioned skeptical theism and how that might pose a problem for, at the very least, Swinburne's version. That's a Bayesian version, because he has to assign some sort of probability judgment about what God would do. Would God create a world such that we would have these aesthetic experiences? Does skeptical theism pose a problem for your argument, your version?
Good question. The short answer is I'm not sure. I used to think the answer was no. I'm less confident about that now, but I'll still give you my best case for why it doesn't. The argument I'm making is abductive. So it compares two hypotheses by comparing their explanatory power. with respect to some target phenomenon. And there seem to be cases in which we can offer personal explanations that are adequate without making explicit probability judgments like the ones Swinburne makes. And in fact, we can sometimes offer sound personal explanations even when the probability that the agent to which our explanation adverts, the probability that they would bring about the relevant phenomenon is maybe low or inscrutable for us. So let me give you an example. This isn't one I give in the paper. I actually think this one's slightly better than the one I give in the paper, though. So suppose we went to Mars and we found, well, okay, then we might have reason to think it's human. So let's fast forward far into the future. Human beings have somehow traveled to the Andromeda Galaxy, and we land on a planet in the Andromeda Galaxy, and we find this little rover running around on the surface of the planet. Now, we've got virtually no background information about this rover. We don't know what it's for. We don't know who built it. But it seems like we're still justified in explaining the rover in terms of personal agency. Because again, we've got those two criteria we can ask about. First, would an intelligent agent have reasons to build a rover? Well, yeah, maybe. Like, we can think of some reasons why they might do that. In fact, we build rovers all the time. So, well, not all the time. It's not a super common occurrence, but we do it for good reasons. So, an intelligent agent would have reason to build this little rover. And second, could there be agents in the Andromeda Galaxy who have the ability to build a rover like this? Well, as far as we know, yeah. So it seems like we're justified in inferring that the rover is a product of intelligent agency. And that seems like the right result. It seems like if you did in fact come across that rover, what you should conclude is that it was produced by an intelligent agent. So notice that you need very little background information about the rover, and you can have no background information at all about the agents responsible for the rover. And you can still draw this sort of inference. And you don't need to make any explicit probability judgments at all in order to make the inference. Now, some Bayesians are going to say, well, yeah, but you're still making some implicit probability judgments. Or maybe they're not judgments at all. But the kind of computation in which your brain engages when it draws abductive inferences is still Bayesian under the hood. And so if that's true, if there's no way to draw abductive inferences without doing some Bayesian calculations under the hood, so to speak, then skeptical theism might still pose a problem for the kind of argument I'm making, because it would show that whatever process is going on under the hood in abductive arguments, abductive inferences to the existence of God is an unreliable process. It's not the sort of process that could really lead us to the truth about God, given that his reasons are inaccessible to us, given that we can't predict what he likely would do if he existed. So, yeah, I'm on the fence about that. This involves a bunch of really complicated questions in like formal epistemology and cognitive science, and I'm just not prepared to take a position on those controversial questions. But
yeah. Okay, so skeptical theism might be the best objection that we've discussed, because the others were based on evolutionary explanations, and it seemed like none of those were very good. So skeptical theism might give the opponent of the argument a way out. However, I want to point something out to people. If that's your way out of the argument, then to be consistent when it comes to the problem of evil, it looks like you're going to have to play fair both ways. So if you think skeptical theism is going to get you out of this one, then it's going to get you out of the problem of evil. But if you think that, skeptical theism doesn't work, the problem of evil is good, then it's not going to work over here either. So I want to point people out, just play fair.
Yeah, this is actually, I think, a really important area for further research in philosophy of religion. We should be asking whether it's possible to have a robust program of natural theology while simultaneously endorsing skeptical theism. There are some people working on that, but not enough, I would say. So I'm hoping to see some papers come out about this in the near future.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'll point something out right now. I've done an interview with Dr. John DePoe, who he makes a distinction between negative skeptical theism and positive skeptical theism. And the way that he develops positive skeptical theism is such that you can have a sort of robust natural theology and be skeptical theist. He develops. So I'll just say, if you're interested in at least, looking at that, what has been written on that, I'm sure more work's being done, but something that has been written on this topic, I've done an interview on my channel with him about positive skeptical theism. So I'll point people to that if they're interested. Okay, let's wrap up with one additional objection. And that is, hey, you've been thinking of naturalism as a sort of naturalism that if it's going to explain this, it needs to explain it with respect to evolutionary mechanisms at work. But that's not the only thing that naturalism can use to try and explain this. Perhaps there is no good evolutionary explanation. Instead, you have people like Thomas Nagel who have a sort of view of naturalism where teleology is a part of it. There's these sort of like teleological laws, things with like certain ends to them, laws with certain ends to them. And so perhaps this sort of aesthetic experience is just the outcome of just these teleological laws at the base. And there's no mind under it. It's just pure nature, pure laws. But I hope I'm characterizing that correctly. You can tell me if I've not characterized it correctly.
No, that seems right. So you're talking about the view Nagel lays out in Mind and Cosmos. And what he says is, take the possibility space that's consistent with the laws of nature. And that's just all the outcomes, all the physical outcomes that are consistent with those laws. Well, some of the outcomes consistent with those laws are more orderly than others. And Nagel hypothesizes that reality is actually biased in some way toward the more orderly outcomes. That's a possible view, but it just seems really strange to me. In particular, it seems to involve some sort of, if not backwards, causation by possible but non-actual states of affairs. Like there are these possible states of affairs, they're orderly, and their orderliness somehow explains why they come about. So it seems like there's a sort of explanatory circularity going on. So that's one reason to be skeptical of the view. I think if you could make a view like this work, it would constitute a genuine alternative to theism, qua explanation of aesthetic experience. If you wanted to say, well, one of the ways that reality is biased is toward experiences that are intrinsically valuable in some way. Well, then if you think, as I do, that aesthetic experiences are intrinsically valuable, and like you need that assumption for my argument to work, then you'll think, well, this sort of naturalism does have the resources to explain the data captured by premise one. But like I said, I just don't think that sort of naturalism is plausible. What I think is that Nagel should just be a theist. I think he's recognized that the world is an orderly place. It's not the sort of world that we would expect if all there was impersonal material forces. And so he does say in that book, he says, I mean, you could explain all of this if you were a theist, but I'm just not going to consider that possibility. There are reasons for that. Like you can't consider every alternative in one book. It's just one book. But yeah, I think that, so I think if that sort of naturalism could be made to work, it would constitute an alternative to theism. I just don't think it's a very attractive alternative. I think if you're attracted to that alternative, you should just be a theist.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed the paper and I enjoyed getting to interview you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's an honor to be here.
Believe it or not, there are many new arguments for God that you're probably unaware of. One of them is the argument from nomological harmony. Click here right now to see how it goes. I'll see you in the next video.